Welcome to today's webinar with AATE. We'll be talking about making the case for theater education with the government today. We'll start our conversation off with an introduction and then move through a recap of the last few months of webinars that we've been talking about making the case for theater education. We'll continue to discuss the infrastructure around advocacy in the United States, some examples of successes, have a quick conversation, and wrap up with next steps. As you may know, this is the third webinar in a series of 4 titled Making the Case for Theater Education. We began in January looking at the basics around case making. Last month, we talked about making the case in your community with collaborative partners from other sectors. Today, we'll be discussing the role of making the case for theater education, specifically with the government. And next month, we'll conclude about embedding the practices of case making for theater education within your roles in your schools or communities. The goals for today's webinar are to examine the arts advocacy infrastructure within the United States, to explore the federal asks and state and local examples of advocacy for theater education, and to identify actionable steps to take in your state or community. My name is Jeff Poulin, and I'll be with you over the course of today's webinar and throughout this series, occasionally with guests. It's my pleasure to be with you all and to connect with folks all across the country through AATE. My work comes in the form of Creative Generation, which is an emerging organization that works to inspire, connect, and amplify the work of individuals and organizations who are committed to cultivating the creative capacities of the next generation. We're partnering with AATE to help expand the impact of theater educators and the National Association alike. We'll begin by recapping the last few webinars and our discussions about making the case for theater education. We began by pondering a question. How do we, as a field of theater education practitioners, talk about theater education and its impact? We discussed the role of compelling data plus effective storytelling equaling advocacy for change. Our discussion stemmed from the communications process, something that we're probably all very familiar with, us being the sender, conveying a message to a receiver among noise and receiving feedback. This could be amplified in its impact by observing the storytelling arc, examining our objective, the big idea, and how it impacts others within our process. We looked at different types of data and how those can be coupled with stories to make the case, using local examples, connecting to regional data collection, and extrapolating for national impact. Next, last month, we looked at the connection of theater education to numerous sectors across the social impact spectrum. We looked towards international models, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and how theater education can be a part of the solution for achieving these large-scale initiatives. We looked at different types of partnerships, thinking about how we can connect with other cross-sector partners to achieve impact and impact the lives of young people through theater education. And we looked at one very particular model that's becoming incredibly popular in the United States called collective impact, whereby partners observe a common agenda, use shared measurement metrics, have mutually enforcing activities, are constantly in communication, and receive support from a backbone institution. That had a few flaws though, and we looked at them and looked at new and different ways of engaging stakeholders and young people to make sure that the diversity of participants in theater education are centered in our work. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the infrastructure behind arts education advocacy in this country. When we begin to think about arts education advocacy within the United States, and I'll just stop there because we think about arts education inclusive of theater, dance, media arts, music, and visual arts. because in public policy, the arts are collectively unified. So in this model, we have to think about the broad spectrum of stakeholders when considering public policy for theater education and the other arts disciplines, as well as the arts and cultural sector as a whole. There are three tiers of players that we must consider. The first is the federal spectrum, including the White House, Congress, the US Department of Education, national associations like the School Boards Association and PTA, state boards of education, and so forth, and a number of arts and arts education organizations like AATE. Those federal players work together to craft public policy, whether it be funding and appropriations or policy and guidance, to compel state-level actors to engage in state and regional strategy to impact the implementation of theater and arts education in communities and schools. At the state level, we have a very similar infrastructure, including state legislatures, governors, the State Department of Education, state superintendent, state-level associations in the arts and arts education, and other players like teachers' unions. These folks come together and articulate the plans for statewide implementation of education and funding procedures to ensure that arts education is equitably delivered to students in communities. In those communities, at the local level, we have our next tier down that have a whole separate set of distinct decision makers that range from the school board to curriculum developers to local arts agencies, mayors, cultural organizations, and teaching artists. Other folks like community programs, grant makers, or institutions of higher education are in the mix as well because they play unique roles in partnership with the arts and arts education community. And then of course, those individuals at the local level work directly with students, impacting their day-to-day theater education. When we think about this policy pipeline going from federal to state to local, we must consider that there are also arrows up in this diagram, which I should mention comes from our friends over at Americans for the Arts. Those arrows up signify the feedback loops and mechanisms that are built into our public policy. So our local decision makers use student data to inform their decisions. Our states use local data to inform their plans. And the federal government looks at trends among state policies to inform the next set of public policies and funding measures that are put in place through the federal infrastructure. So we must realize that if we're operating at the local or even the state level, our influence goes both up and down in this diagram. And that's what we're going to look at today, starting at the federal level and trickling down to track how different public policy measures can support theater education in our communities with our students. As you know, at the federal level, most decisions run through the legislative process, which works as one of the three branches of government. Decisions come from either the House or the Senate, then cross the aisle and work with the other side, the House or the Senate, and once agreed upon by both houses in the legislature, they move their way to the president's office for signature into law. Some might consider that policies are a little bit different than funding. However, our funding and our federal appropriations process follows the same standards as a policy being signed into law. In the federal infrastructure, our goal is to create an arts-friendly Congress so that on both sides, the House and the Senate, we have advocates for the arts. And this can be seen in a number of ways. Beginning in the House of Representatives, members can join the Congressional Arts Caucus, the Congressional STEAM Caucus, Science, Technology, Engineering, the Arts, and Math. They can have membership also in the Congressional Humanities Caucus. In the more recent years, we've been looking for indicators of support among members of Congress for signing on to Dear Colleague letters, which serve as letters in a public way to each other's colleagues in the House to encourage them to take action. So there was one that was authored in 2018 and 2019, respectively, about supporting the National Endowment for the Arts. Another that was authored in support of the Office of Museum Services, and a number of others that aren't directly tied to the arts, but may involve the arts. Similarly, we want to encourage our members of Congress to have voted for an amendment offered by Representative Groffman to cut funding from the NEA and the NEH. And we want to make sure that they voted for funding the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. And of course, we'd like to make sure that they voted against HR 1 in 2017, which would have had detrimental impacts on the arts and cultural sector. These indicators help us map the strength and the commitment to the arts of our members of Congress. You can visit a track record of how your member of Congress did through the Arts Action Fund at artsactionfund.org on their congressional report card. While we're working in the House, we also want to cross the complex to look at the Senate. The Senate has a similar infrastructure. There's the Senate Cultural Caucus that's led in a bipartisan fashion by a leading member of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. We also have Dear Colleague letters like in the House from 2018 and 2019 to support the NEA and the NEH and the Office of Museum Services. And again, that same House resolution back in 2017. While working to create and identify that arts-friendly caucus, we must take note of all of the consistent asks that we have to take to our various members. This usually happens through a combined effort of almost 100 national arts and arts education organizations on a day, usually in the springtime in March, called Arts Advocacy Day. The National Arts Action Summit, which is a multi-day event hosted by Americans for the Arts, brings together hundreds of advocates from every state in the union and across artistic disciplines and associations to bring a unified ask to Congress and to talk about the role of the arts and the impact they have in the United States. This year, this day is happening in just a few weeks at the end of March. There are several federal asks that are taken by advocates and their organizations to Capitol Hill in meetings with every single member of Congress and senator, as well as with members of the administration. There's so many asks, we're not going to cover all of them here today, but I'll take a look at some of the specific asks that relate to theater education. The first is the appropriation of funds for fiscal year 2021, specifically asking for funds to the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. These federal cultural agencies have been facing a zero out in the president's recommended budget and a reinstatement of funds, if not more, from Congress in previous years. These federal agencies served as the de facto cultural policy agencies of the United States, and without funding them, there would be no representation of arts and culture within our federal government. The second ask is around funding arts education at the US Department of Education. Since the 90s, there has been a designated fund for the arts at the US Department of Education, which is different than any other academic subject. There's no specific fund for math or science at the Department of Education. This fund has been used in a number of ways, but generally has three buckets. The first is a National Activities Fund that supports, through a competitive grant, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and their national outreach programs around the topics of arts integration and community development. The second activity is called Professional Development for Arts Education, which identifies successful models for PD for arts educators, works to document and scale, and disseminate those learnings to others in the field. The third is around arts education model development and dissemination. This looks at programs of arts education in communities, doing that same documenting and scaling and disseminating the learnings to the field. While the Department of Education isn't able to fund specific arts education programs in every school, district, or even state, these initiatives are meant to show strength in arts education and teach the learning from these specific interventions to elevate our practice as a whole across the country. The third call to action is about strengthening the arts in higher education. For all of our higher ed colleagues out there, this deals with arts programs in public universities and looking at requirements to ensure that the arts work cross-disciplinary in numerous liberal arts programs. The fourth call is for funding Title IV Part A of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Barring the policy language there, what this essentially means is funding a specific pool of activities under the Every Student Succeeds Act, our nation's foremost education policy, to ensure that the arts are considered part of a well-rounded education and implemented as so at the local level. The fifth call to action is around the role of the arts within the juvenile justice system, through specific funding measures and policy guidance in our new juvenile justice policies and acts that were passed in the last 2 years. The sixth item has to deal specifically with tax policy, which is incredibly nuanced, but suffice it to say it will benefit nonprofit arts education organizations who receive donations from local supporters in their communities. The seventh call to action is around passing the CREATE Act and the PLACE Act, which are both small policy reforms to different infrastructures within the Small Business Administration and other institutions within our federal government to make it easier for specific actors within the arts and cultural sector, like teaching artists, to be considered their own small business and have access to supports like any other small business in the country. And lastly, there's a call to support the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs at the Department of State, which works on educational exchanges through the arts as diplomacy to other countries, as well as visas for incoming artists and arts educators to the United States. I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the more apparent asks that we have to the federal government this year. Let's talk about funding, specifically for the National Endowment for the Arts. Since 1992, this political football of a topic has led the National Endowment for the Arts to range in funding from a maximum funding of around $175,000 to the lowest funding of under $100 million over the course of 2 decades. This is due to a number of circumstances that have to deal with politics and the culture wars. But at the end of the day, what we know is that if we were considering inflation, the funding for the National Endowment for the Arts is among the lowest that it could possibly be. In the past few years, you've seen a small uptick. In 2012, during the Obama administration, we saw the lowest of recent time at $146 million of funding to the National Endowment for the Arts. Over the past several years, in spite of the president's calls for termination of the agency, Congress has appropriated small increases in funding from 150 to 153 to 155, and last year, $162 million. Over the past several years, like I mentioned, the president in his annual budget request has recommended termination of both the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. However, Congress, in spite of this requested termination, has decided to fund more and more arts and cultural funding. Through advocacy, we've seen those increases of about $2 to $5 million a year to ensure the sustained support for the arts and its impact in communities across the country. The same has been seen for the Assistance for Arts Education at the US Department of Education. This is that arts education fund that I was talking about. Since 2000, it has been up and down in its support and even faced some challenges in the Obama administration, including President Obama's suggestion to consolidate it with other competitive grants at the US DOE. However, thanks to the Turnaround Arts program from the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities and now the Kennedy Center, and through advocacy work and documentation of impact, the Obama administration overturned that decision and did successfully increase funding to this in its years. During the more recent presidential administration, we've seen an increase of requests and an increase of sustained funding since 2017. This fund at the Department of Education is vitally important because what it does is it allows our field, which has some very specific needs in professional development and program development, to think outside the box, innovate, document, and disseminate the learnings to elevate our entire field across the United States. There's also a specific ask for funding around well-rounded education as a provision of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I've left this very content-rich language here for you so that you can read the specific asks under what is called Title IV Part A. A few things to note here. Many of us over the past 2 decades got really good at talking about the arts as one of the, quote, core academic subjects. However, with the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, the term core academic subjects is no longer relevant. It was replaced with terminology around well-rounded education, or the well-rounded subjects. In the bill passed in 2015, the funding for student support and academic enrichment grants, which falls under Title IV Part A, includes the arts and is authorized to be up to $1.6 billion. In its first year, it was only appropriated at about $400 million. After that, it did go up and cross the $1 billion mark, but it never reached its full authorized potential. So we'd like to see the full funding of that student support and academic enrichment grants under Title IV Part A, which would no doubt help arts education be implemented in its fullest capacity in schools around the country. Additionally, we'd like to make sure that it is explicit about how the arts can help achieve the goals of the Title I program, which deals with the most needy schools in the country. This program has to deal with literacy, and the evidence shows that the arts increase student literacy. And Title I is one of the largest pots of money possible. In California, they've successfully used the arts to achieve the goals of Title I and unlock Title I funding to be used for arts interventions. We'd like to see this guidance from the US Department of Education to see the same success in California as in any other state in the nation. Additionally, we've seen that same trend happen with Title II, which has to deal with teacher professional development. The documentation is there showing how the arts can help teacher professional development and how those funds in Title II can help arts educators professionally develop as well. Additionally, there's a number of calls, including $1.1 million for the 21st Century Community Learning Center's after-school program, the specific $40 million ask that we just discussed for the Assistance to Arts Education program, as well as additional money to the Institute for Educational Services, which administers several reports which tell us about the health and vitality of arts education in the United States, like the Fast Response Survey System and the National Assessment for Educational Progress. When it comes to our federal asks, it's really important to plug into the infrastructure that exists, that's apparent through Arts Advocacy Day and its leading member, the Arts Action Fund. The Arts Action Fund is the arts and culture sector's only PAC, or political action committee. Membership is totally free, and the membership within the Arts Action Fund allows you to keep up to date with what's happening day to day with certain public policies, as we've discussed, as well as with the support of the development of that arts-friendly Congress. Additionally, you can connect with your state captain, which is your state delegate to Arts Advocacy Day that oversees the strategy with members of Congress that represent your state. You can participate here in Washington at the end of March or back home in district when your members are in district. The third thing that you can do is familiarize yourself with these 2020 asks and be sure to use them in your own advocacy in your home community or through your day-to-day work. Let's go on and talk about some of the successes of this infrastructure that's been built around arts education advocacy with our federal, state, and local governments over the past several years. Let's start by talking about the success of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Here you'll see President Obama patting and right after signing this law on December 10th, 2015. What you don't see in this photo is about 12 years of advocacy to keep the arts as part of the core curriculum in light of the non-reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. As many of us know, the arts were considered a core academic subject in No Child Left Behind, as well as its precursor federal policy called Goals 2000. No Child Left Behind expired and Congress didn't reauthorize. In fact, we entered a period known as the waiver years, where every state had a waiver from their required stances in the federal government. The passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act was highly successful. It was bipartisan in nature, led by Senator Lamar Alexander, a Republican from Tennessee, and Senator Patty Murray, a Democrat from Washington. The bill had about 12 arts-friendly provisions. Even at this very bill signing was introduced by a student, you see him there on the left side of your screen wearing a red tie, who went to an arts magnet school in Northern Virginia. And in his opening remarks at this bill signing before introduced president, he said that every day he shows up to school and has band rehearsal, then he goes to English, math, science, and history, and finishes day off with play practice, and that this bill would make every school like his school. And that's exactly what we hope to see through the numerous arts-friendly provisions. This was a huge success. There was federal advocacy from across the board, people from all 50 states working with their members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, people from all the disciplines coming together to ensure that arts education was kept core or now well-rounded. And what we saw was a number of arts-friendly provisions that, even with decision-making pushed to the states, allowed for the arts to be uniquely positioned as a part of every child's education. However, like I mentioned, most of the decisions from the Every Student Succeeds Act were pushed to those state-level actors, which caused a surge in state-level advocacy from coast to coast. There were three major asks for our states when considering the implementation at their local level. The first was to make sure that the arts were part of this well-rounded provision, as we've already discussed, and that it was replicated at the state level. The second was for states to engage in supporting the education program, using the models that were developed the funding at the US Department of Education and implementing them with fidelity within their own states. And lastly, we wanted to see states take advantage of the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program, which hopefully would be funded someday at its authorized level of $1.65 billion. These block grants go to states, and many of them actually ended up leaving money on the table. So we want to see the full implementation of these funds within all of our states across the board. One example that I'll give you is the state of Missouri. The Missouri Alliance for Arts Education, which is the state's arts education advocacy organization, lobbies at their state capitol in Jefferson City every single year. The photo you see is almost 400 young people filling the halls of their state legislature with music, dance, theater, and visual art for an entire day. I had the pleasure of attending this ceremony where they brought bands and choruses, theater troupes, and dance ensembles to not only entertain, but to also deliver the impact of arts education to the doors of their members of their state legislature. Young people were testifying with their hometown congressmen. Our arts educators were delivering the latest reports on access and equity within their state. From 8 in the morning until 7 at night, there was an arts festival happening in the main foyer of the legislature, as you see here in the photo, as well as on the lawn and on the steps of the governor's mansion. What we were able to see is they were able to successfully lobby their legislators to keep the arts as part of their state ESSA plan, to ensure that they were implementing with fidelity the arts as part of the well-rounded education, utilizing federal models, and ensuring the delivery of all of the art forms, dance, media arts, music, theater, and visual arts within Missouri schools. This was not just a casual happenstance, though. This took a year's worth of strategy, educators from across the state, students from the North and the South, the East and the West, to come together in the center of their state at the state capitol to share their art and carry their advocacy banner. They received training about using the data that was compiled by the Alliance with their compelling stories of what they see day to day. This tremendous effort was brought together by using a hired lobbyist, as well as former teachers and retired band directors to lead the effort. They also brought me in from Washington, D.C. to share a little bit of my own experience and how other states were working. But the point here is that the handful of leaders were well informed. but it really did take everyone in their statewide community to come together to deliver the message. So I would encourage you all to plug in with your state advocacy group in your state capital, wherever that may be, to ensure that you're part of this conversation and lending your stories, your experiences, and your voice to their cause. The second example I'll share harkens back to a conversation we had last month with Carla Rivera, who is the Director of Public Policy at Ingenuity, a local arts advocacy group in Chicago. Ingenuity's focus is ensuring access to a high-quality arts education equitably across the city of Chicago. Most recently, their effort was when they had a new mayor. This wasn't a full-fledged 600-person performing all-day account like we saw in Missouri, but what they did is they worked strategically with their new mayor, Lori Lightfoot, in crafting her policy agenda in advancing arts and culture in the city of Chicago, starting with arts education in their schools. They used the data that they collected through their mapping process to make the case for the need for a systemic approach to ensuring the arts as part of the lives of every child in the city. They worked with the mayor's office to consider how they might work within the structures currently in place in the city, make changes to current policies, and support their efforts with designated funding to close the arts gap. This effort of working with new policymakers positions the arts really successfully within the agenda of pursuit of any elected official. What we can learn from this is that working with candidates when they're in their process of being elected ensures that we're also at the table once they are elected. There's always a little bit of risk and gamble, but working with local government officials is actually quite easy. Inviting them to your theater performances, giving them an opportunity to address a crowd when you're at a gathering of like-minded theater individuals, and tapping into their own interests. Everyone has a story about their experience with theater. Maybe it's their own child's experience, their own experience acting on a stage, but encouraging them to share that and join your community. That's what they did in Chicago, and that's how they got the support of the now mayor, Lori Lightfoot. What I would encourage you to consider is to connect with your state arts advocacy organization and plug into the infrastructure happening throughout your state. I would encourage you to engage in local advocacy with decision makers through various coalitions. Think about who has like-minded goals, how you can work together, like we discussed last time, and connect with those decision makers at the most local level. And I'd consider translating what we talked about in our federal asks to help build a grassroots support by increasing the knowledge and policy literacy of yourself, your staffs, your peers, and others that are engaged in your programs locally. Imagine if every theater goer, every theater education parent, or even every student knew those few talking points that we talked about at the beginning, asking for increased funding to support the federal infrastructure or changes in policy at the local level. The ripple for the tide would be really strong. And that's why having grassroots, as well as grasstops advocacy matters. So I'd like to open it up to discussion. I'm happy to address any questions that you might have or allow others to share some of their own experiences engaging in our public policy advocacy from their own experience. We have about 8 minutes left. So I'll put some prompts up, but I'll encourage you all to share either through the chat box or by unmuting your computer. Oh, I have one question that was just sent to me privately, which might be more of a question for AATE, but they're asking how to get involved with Arts Advocacy Day to represent theater education. I'll speak from my experience and allow others to chime in as well, but I would say that the event is scheduled for, I believe it's March 30th this year, and it's not too late to sign up. And I'd also allow you to consider the option too, that if Washington, DC, not in time for Arts Advocacy Day, you can always visit your member of Congress, speak with their staff, and bring forward your advocacy for theater education to them at any time. That's part of their job. They're public servants, and I would encourage you to do so. And even sometimes when it's not one of these designated hill days, as we call them here in Washington, it's sometimes more successful to share in an off-peak time, if you will. So I would consider getting in touch with the AATE to maybe represent them at the national convening, but also to consider meeting with your legislators here in Washington anytime you're in town, or to meet with them when they're in their home district. Every member of Congress has an office in their home district, if not two, and you can set up time with their local staff and with them when they are home on any congressional recesses, which sometimes can be more successful. Any other questions or reflections?
Hi, Jeff, this is Mitch from Roundabout Theater Company.
Hey, Mitch.
Hi. And we were just reflecting here as we were listening about the presence and existence of service organizations, you know, with the highlight you did of Missouri, of how the whole state got together. And I'm just aware that some cities are great and have service organizations, and some cities don't. Some states do, some states seem to lack them. Do you have any additional comments on that?
Sure, there is an infrastructure, and having held some of the roles that I've held in arts education advocacy in this country, I know that in some places it's more apparent than others. However, it's not that there's ever a lack of advocates. So sometimes most states, for example, have what is called an Arts Education Alliance, which is an organization that is formed for the explicit purposes of unifying the arts education community together and bringing forward public policy asks to government. However, some states don't, or they might in name, but it's not quite functional. However, in those circumstances, there is often someone carrying the banner. So sometimes it's about locating those stakeholders and connecting with them to bring forward that unified front. I'll share with you the example from Tennessee. They had many years ago the Tennessee Alliance for Arts Education, which lost its steam and didn't have much going on, and in the past few years reconstituted as Arts Ed Tennessee, actually led by a bunch of corporate leaders who believe that arts education and creativity is essential to the workforce of the state. They then hooked up with the Music Educators Association and Theater Educators Association and dance and so forth, and were able to bring them together. But it was sort of an unconventional way to approach it by having the support of for-profit music manufacturers. At the end of the day, though, there still was an infrastructure there, even though it didn't fit the standard model. So wherever you are, whether you're in Massachusetts, Idaho, Texas, or the Virgin Islands, there are arts education advocacy groups available to connect with. It's just about locating them. And I'm also happy to connect with anyone that I have contacts with through the infrastructure that I know about. So I'll put my contact information up here at the end, and be sure to send me a note if you'd like to plug into one of those organizations.
That was great, thank you.
And also, not to mention that when we talk about local, Mitch, I know you're in New York City, but of course that's a massive city with, you know, over 1 million students. But in a lot of other places, local is considered county. So I know for the state of Florida, there's pretty much an arts education service organization for every county. In other places, they may be county or multi-county or multi-city. So it's something to consider as you think about that, to look countywide or regionally as well.
Jeff, sorry, this is Mitch again. And the next conversation, just based on what you just shared about counties and active, is actually about like, how do those organizations get the word out? And so much of this work is like volunteer, right? It's, I know you've had the fortune of working for organizations that are doing this, but there's a lot of volunteer time necessary. Do you have any advice in sort of that world?
You're entirely right. I'll break that into two parts. One is how do those organizations connect with others? And that is sort of the nature of grassroots movement building, is connecting with people sort of where they're at and making sure that you're in touch through conduits. So one of the things that I always encourage advocacy organizations to consider is finding those people that sort of act as hubs and that are natural connectors. And then, of course, maintaining a very up-to-date email list. That's sort of the other key. But those organizations oftentimes do rely on that grassroots infrastructure building. So it does take individuals like you to reach out and say, hey, I'm interested, please put me on your list so that I can keep up to date. Because they can't be, if they're doing the good work and fighting the good fight, they also can't be out there trying to sign people up 40 hours a week. So that's something to consider, that we do ask people to be a little proactive in that movement building, which sort of leads to the second part of your question around volunteerism. And you're entirely right. It is part of the gig to spend a little bit of time doing this. And I say that because I have a really firm belief, and why I even am part of having this conversation through AATE, is all of us have a professional responsibility to be advocates for theater education. I view it as part of your role as a theater educator, a program administrator, a nonprofit fundraiser, whatever, that 5% of your time should be for advocacy. Whether that is with your peer institution down the road, you want to be an advocate for them to think about how theater education impacts their work, or whether it's with the city council, the mayor's office, the state legislature, or the president of the United States, that we spend our time advocating as part of our daily practice. That's actually what we're going to be spending the entire next webinar on, is strategies for integrating advocacy as part of our day-to-day practice. I argue it's part of our professional responsibility, specifically because, well, I'll phrase it this way. How many members of Congress are arts educators? Well, there's 435 members of Congress, and exactly 0 of them are arts educators. So though they may support arts education in theory, they're not necessarily the most informed about what it is that we need. So it's our professional responsibility to articulate it to them, what we need. And that might be $1.65 billion for the Assistance for Arts Education Fund, or it may be reauthorizing funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, or it may be a certain type of outlet so that the kiln or the lighting board will work in our space. They don't have the knowledge that we have, because we are the ones on the ground doing the work day to day. So if we are not generous with our time, if we are not advocating and sharing the needs of the arts education community, then decision makers won't necessarily know what it is that will help us achieve our goal. We should not forget that Americans believe that the arts should be part of every child's education. That's a huge statistic. 9 out of 10 Americans rarely can agree on anything. But arts education is one of those things. So it's not that we don't have public will, it's that they don't necessarily know how to best support our community. So it's our job to help them. Great. Any last questions?
Hi, this is Mitch again. I'm raising my hand so many times, I'm sorry. I've heard recently a lot of advocates talk about like 1%. Like if we could get 1% of the city budget dedicated to arts and culture, if we could get 1% of the state budget dedicated to arts and culture, that would be such a huge win, which simultaneously I'm thrilled to hear that that would be a win, because it's so depressing that we don't even have that. Do you have a magic number, or would you just point us back towards that list earlier in the slides of like, advocate for these?
Sure, yeah, I don't think that there is a magic number, partly because if you were to ask this question, how much funding currently goes to arts education, no one can answer it. Because when schools are ordering pencils, they're not tracking how many pencils go to the art room and how many pencils go to the math room. Part of it is that we don't have total autonomy over certain spaces. So sometimes, I know in the town I grew up on, there was one theater in the town, and it was used for every school, as well as for general town assemblies and the senior center and all sorts of things. And so if we start getting into that question, one, it will take a really long time to set a baseline. And second, we don't really know how to measure that. Or if we start measuring it, it's going to take up all of our time, and we're not actually going to be implementing theater education programs the right way. So my solution is usually that everything is highly customized to the community that you're in, to the state that you're in, or to the fiscal year at the federal level that we're in. We always want to see certain realities. For example, within the federal funding infrastructure, like I mentioned, we want to see full funding because there is a cap and actually there's a ceiling and a floor put on that number for funding Title IV Part A. I think it's 400 million at the lowest level and 1.65 billion at the highest level. So obviously we want to push to the highest level to ensure that more dollars per student are going to support their arts education. However, we have that, you know, so it would be ill-informed to say, well, we want to have $2 billion because by law it can't go more than 1.65, or so therefore we can't say that we want 1% because that would actually be in violation of law. So sometimes not to discount the question, but to say, put a little bit of trust into some of these folks that are coming up with the asks when there are concrete asks, so that we can follow them and have that unified voice that is kind of grounded in reality, but also to work with every situation being customizable. New York City, again, to bring in that example, saw some real successes with the de Blasio administration where certain funds were allocated for arts education to close the arts gap within the city's infrastructure. That was tremendous, but $35 million, you know, can't come up in, you know, Pinellas County, Florida. Like, that's just not going to happen. They don't have that type of money. New York City does. So everything sort of must be customized to meet the needs of that specific school district and student population, as well as the specific realities of that governmental infrastructure. And thank you so much for all the questions. I really do appreciate it. So with that, we'll come to an end for today, but I will share with you some next steps as well as my contact information so we can continue to remain in touch. Mark your calendar for April 14th at 3 p.m., which is our next and final webinar in this 4-part series. We'll be talking about, as I mentioned earlier, the instilling advocacy and case making as a practice within your theater education world. I'll be joined by my colleague, Jennifer Katona, who is a real great thinker in this space, and we'll be sharing some of her experience as a theater educator, professor, and as now someone who works for a school district. We'll be engaging in really sort of a professional reflection as well as some hands-on approaches to crafting a plan to be a change maker in our own community. Our goals today were to examine the arts advocacy infrastructure within the United States, to explore the federal asks and state and local partnerships, and to identify actionable steps to take in your state or in your community. I think we achieved those things. And if we didn't, or if you still have any questions, please feel free to contact me at this contact information on your screen. I'd be more than happy to get back with you. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you next month.